Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, July 8th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part 2. Last week we presented part 1, World Trade Center Building 7. If you missed it, be sure to search for it on YouTube, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. This is part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. We'll be examining the forensic evidence and the dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. First, before we go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Mr. Andy Steele, the host of 9/11 Freefall Radio. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is go to ae911truth.org and select continuing education and then select the live webinars. You'll see a box right there. I'll also be looking at the YouTube chats and the Facebook chats for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. I see there's a question asking how to submit a question to us. Just type it into the YouTube box, and especially if it's at the beginning, I will see it. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks so much, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. But I now work full-time educating architects and engineers and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get into it. The Twin Towers today. The design, first of all, some hailed it as the crowning achievement of the international style. Others lambasted it as gigantic dumbness. Robert Stern, right? You extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Compare that to the beautiful unfolding massing of the Empire State Building, which up until this time in 1976 was the tallest building in the world. So there were many innovations, though, associated with this massive project, each floor being an acre in size, 110 stories, reaching over 1,400 feet. But one of them was getting all these occupants, 50,000 of them in each building, plus 140,000 visitors every day to their floors, their workplaces. So how do you do that? They had to break the building down into 3 sub-buildings and bring an elevator to a sky lobby, and then from there take a targeted elevator to your specific floor in that section of building. This had never been done before and was a brilliant solution to that problem. The other problem they had in high-rises is a forest of columns every 30 feet or so, just to make the building sturdy enough since it was so high. In the Twin Towers, they didn't want to have to deal with the impact on the tenants' office layouts with this. So what did they do? They moved half these columns out to the outside, forming an exoskeleton with 3 vertical columns, 3 horizontal spandrel panels welded in the shop, brought out and erected and bolted on site. And this was a novel concept. And on the interior, they had 47 massive core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches at the bottom, 30 inches by 16 inches in midspan, like you see here. Almost solid steel at the bottom and thinning to very thin steel at the top. Between the two structures, they had these lightweight steel trusses which spanned between them, and they were bolted in place. And then a 4-inch, and on the mechanical floors, 8-inch thick concrete slab was poured over metal decking that was welded to these decks, these floor joists. So we have an incredible open office area, certainly on two sides, 60 feet span and 30 feet on the other two sides. Each tower had 3.8 million square feet of rentable space. Or is that rentable? But probably overall space. 43,000 square feet per floor total. That's an acre in size. Incredible. And as you can see, for the first time in skyscraper history, we have now open area. So they could lay out these offices without respect, without columns getting in the way all over the place. But they did have some drawbacks. We have columns marching around the outside of the office space every 3 feet 4 inches with narrow 2-foot windows. Some thought of it as a jail cell, in fact, especially compared to the 80s when office buildings began to open up their vista to the cityscape below. And they also required, by the time of the 90s, massive quantities of cost for mechanical and electrical and communication systems, which were severely outdated, as you can imagine, building built in the 70s. And all of a sudden dealing with the technology of the 90s. The asbestos was required to have been abated from the building by federal law. So that was a $5 to $10 billion project, depending on how it was calculated. So these were white elephants, which by some measures of researchers found that they were only half occupied by which is a severe financial white elephant, a real problem for the developers. In this case, the Port Authority, public buildings, but they weren't making money. So they put it out to bid, and in a deal consummated 6 weeks prior to 9/11, Larry Silverstein, who invested $125 million of his own money, ended up owning in a 30-year lease, 99-year lease, the entire complex. He had already developed Building 7, which we looked at last week, and in the 80s. And he now owns the entire complex free and clear because of the way the deal was structured. So from 125 million of his own money, he came out in a $3.2 billion deal. He now walked away with $5.68 billion to rebuild. So he's doing very well. We have, though, the story of the planes impacting the buildings that we're about today, along with the jet fuel, which were said with those planes to have brought the buildings down. So we're going to take a deeper look into that. Let's start with the story that developed.
On September 11, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell. And we're just going to get into it and see if it's true. First, we note that the North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning by Flight 11 of American Airlines. It collapses over an hour and a half later. So there's a fire in between those two events, the impact of the airplanes and the collapse. And the fire is said to have been started by jet fuel. And even NIST acknowledges that most of that jet fuel burns up outside the building. The rest of it, they say, was gone in 10 minutes. So it merely served to start a fire which is then ascribed to the weakening of steel, as we'll see. In the case of the South Tower, similarly, it collapses about an hour later after it's hit by Flight 175 at 9:03 a.m. So a lot of people actually associate the incredible jet fuel explosion outside the building with the power to bring down the building. And again, as NIST acknowledges, that this is simply not so. It's the fire that burned, they say. Well, we'll look at those fires in a moment. There were some official investigations, starting with volunteers under the American Society of Civil Engineers. Volunteers who worked themselves into the subsequent investigations for the most part. The FEMA report, which came out in May of 2002, it had some funding, at least $600,000, but their efforts were quite hampered. In fact, the New York Times documents that they didn't have access to the blueprints, to the site, to the public to appeal to for photographs and so forth. So it's as if their hands were tied. Finally, NIST gets $20 million of funding. NIST is an agency under the Department of Commerce, which is under the Bush administration, whose leadership was changed out when the Bush administration came into power before 9/11. So these are important factoids to consider as well. What's their theory? It's the column failure theory. They say that these raging fires, which we'll look at in a moment and see if they're raging at the time of the collapse, caused the sagging of these floor trusses, which pulled in the perimeter columns and caused them to buckle, apparently all the way around the building fairly uniformly, which is not possible, actually, as we'll look at also. So what do they do to prove this? They have a computer model. In the computer model, they impose a 5,000-pound load on every column to floor truss connection all the way around the building. And this is said to have been enough in their computer model to destroy the building, to cause the collapse. We have, however, not enough force from sagging columns to pull in perimeter excuse me, sagging trusses to pull in perimeter columns. There's not enough force. In fact, we'll do that calculation. Okay. All right. So they simply impose it in their computer model. This is called fraud, and it's only the first example of dozens and dozens which we'll be looking at today, because the fires themselves are cooler, indicate at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke, and these fires are diminished an hour and a half later after the impacts of the planes. So they're not available to even cause the sagging of these floor trusses at the temperatures that even NIST acknowledges were fairly minimal in the area of the plane impacts. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We have a question: how did the towers come down? Well, we do some background research, make some observations. We come up with our best guess. This is called a hypothesis. Based on this research, maybe the jet plane impacts brought them down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires, reasonable suspicions. Maybe it was explosions, for which we'll be looking at a whole lot of evidence today. And controlled demolition, which we'll also be looking at this week and next week. But we lay out all of the hypotheses without favoriting one or another, without respect to our personal financial or political leanings or objectives or ties that might sway our objective opinion in the matter of what brought down the towers. And this is a very important criteria, because we'll be looking at evidence to suggest that this report produced by NIST was not objective whatsoever. We test those hypotheses with experiments after making predictions. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data from the architects and engineers, for instance, who are tasked with ensuring the public safety, especially using the excuse, as NIST did with respect to Building 7, that it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release these this computer input data. So no, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we found in the case of Building 7, and as we'll find today, as I suspect that you will find, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis. That's what we're about at AE 911 Truth, looking at a new hypothesis that was not examined, considered at all by NIST. In fact, it was censored and whitewashed, as we'll see. So until we find a hypothesis that is corroborated. So with that in mind, let's go back, perform some background research, and discover what are the forces that destroy buildings. Perform research. Make an amendment to some of these slides, such as fire-induced collapses are symmetrical. High-rises haven't collapsed before 9/11, so we need to. They're asymmetrical. Fire is an organic process. It's very chaotic. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So this is extremely important. In fact, even NIST admits that the fires don't burn in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. This is commonly understood by fire protection engineers around the world. So they have to acknowledge it, and yet they claim that these fires were persisting for hours, in the case of Building 7, around the particular column that they were focusing on there, column 79. Here it's similar, and yet we haven't lost a skyscraper due to collapses. These especially fireproofed steel frame skyscrapers. They're a unique building type. Wood frame buildings can certainly catch on fire. The very structure is flammable. They fall over to the path of least resistance, following the laws of entropy or increasing chaos. So what about buildings? We looked last week at this study, the worst case study of its kind, 8-story building they built out of steel, some of which was fireproofed, some of which was not, all of which was subjected to incredibly hot fires, as you can see by the incredible fuel loads that they stacked all throughout the building. And they found that the fireproof steel did very, very well. The unfireproof steel merely sagged. There was no chance of a collapse. They found that it's inherently stable behavior here due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. The connections don't fail. They remain intact. And yet, as we saw last week, it's the connections in that steel frame building, building 7, that are said to have failed, even though that building was fireproofed. And this one, in this test, is not. So be sure to see that. It's free on YouTube. 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a 3-part series. That was part 1. So let's look at some of these buildings, steel frame fireproof buildings that are fully engulfed, some of them in fire, but none of them fail.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these high-rise fires, which are fully engulfing these buildings, collapse these buildings. No, it just hasn't happened. And yet these fires are said to have brought these buildings down. All of a sudden, we have a complete shift in what fires can do, and what minimal fires can do as well. Buildings that cause collapse due to natural causes, the building is recognizable as a building afterward. We don't have the severing of the columns and beams. The building is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we'll see later with regard to the Twin Towers. These buildings exploded. They were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds from the incredible heat, from the hot gases, from the ignition of the explosions, in cauliflower-shaped forms that are expanding rapidly due to the incredible quantity of heat. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions can be harnessed quite effectively in controlled demolitions to bring buildings down, like you see in this series of controlled demolitions. Well, there's only a handful of companies in the United States that can even handle this type of work. It's quite an art and a science. And what they do is they engineer at key locations in the buildings thousands of shaped cutter charges, which are synchronized to go off floor by floor, usually starting at the bottom, and produce effects as you see here, and like the old hotels in Las Vegas. So there's a set of features associated with these controlled demolitions. And what are they? One of them is there's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure. There's a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. Because there's a patterned removal of column supports. That's how that happens. There's a free fall acceleration often, or near free fall, straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the way, steel structure. The total dismemberment of structural steel frame is one of the results, therefore, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. And we have limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. We have explosions heard by witnesses. We have flashes of light seen by them. We have broken up concrete floors or pulverized. You don't want to have to go back and jackhammer those by hand. No, let the explosives do that work as well. And so there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the explosive controlled demolition industry. Isolated explosive ejections, they are. And so there's chemical evidence left behind in the aftermath. So if you have these features, guess what? You have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. So you can be pretty sure if you have all of them that you have an explosive controlled demolition. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. Why is that? Well, one reason we haven't lost a steel frame skyscrapers because steel is very dense. It conducts that heat away from its source. So it never gets, or rarely gets, to 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, a critical temperature at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. So we don't want that to ever happen. So, and just in case, we put cementitious fireproofing on. That lasts 2 hours. In a 2 hour fire, the beams are going to last that long, and in 3 hours on the columns. So this is 4 to 6 times longer than we need to last the 20 or 30 minutes that fire can even burn in any particular situation, as here acknowledged by NIST. So just to keep that from happening, from ever becoming a problem, we make sure that tenants don't bring in huge quantities of flammables or content, which it can be a problem. We make sure the contractors don't build the buildings out of combustible materials. That's my dog. He gets excited sometimes. So to keep all that from happening and fire to ever become a problem, we put fire sprinklers in the buildings, and we make sure that they are extinguished. And in the case of the Twin Towers, the fire sprinklers are said to have been their capacity or capability was impacted by the impact of the airplanes. So but we don't argue that point. Although it is arguable. We look at the evidence for controlled demolition and the corroborative evidence and eyewitness testimony, such as government documentation, foreknowledge of the destruction, experts' testimony. Yeah, that looks like a controlled demolition. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that we're going to apply to the Twin Towers at this point. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location? Where? At the base of the structure? Not necessarily. At the this is a magic show we're looking at. It's a deceptive controlled demolition. We're being directed to focus on the point of jet plane impacts because that is said to be the source of the collapse of the towers. And indeed, so that's where the onset of destruction starts with explosives and the evidence of which we're going to be looking at today. But let's look at the sudden onset of the destruction of this. There's no jolt, there's no impact when one part of the structure is said to hit another. And it's smooth, it's sudden, and this is not what we would expect at all in a steel frame building. Collapse. If we were to ever see one, or in the South Tower, same problem. Standing still, and all of a sudden we're in smooth, sudden downward motion, and we'll look at the speed of this downward motion later. But do we have patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, let's look at the oral histories of the first responders, commissioned by Thomas von Essen before they became reshaped by a collective memory. That was his concern. And so 500 of them were recorded. And turns out through the deep research of Professor Graham McQueen, we found out that several of these are witnesses of explosions because the court released, forced the city to release these accounts to the New York Times because the New York Times sued him. Thank God they did something right. And they got these transcripts, and they're actually on their website today. You can read them. Professor Graham McQueen did, and he found that 118 and now 156 of these first responders observed flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena of explosive demolition. Like this one. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, listen, again and again, you're going to hear this particular order of events. In this case, the ground shaking. In other cases, hearing or seeing evidence of explosions, and then the building coming down. These are professional firefighters, most of them we're talking about here. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. Shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all four sides. Material shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building. There was an explosion in the South Tower. One floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower levels of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building, seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions? Well, let's look at the North Tower and see if it looks any, see what they're talking about here. On the right, a known controlled demolition on the left to compare it. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity, slowing it down halfway here, to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a steel frame skyscraper. But no, they relegated those questions to a set of very frequently asked questions posted years later on their website. NIST does not support the controlled demolition collapse is the answer. Controlled demolition theory. Collapse was initiated in the impact and fire floors of the World Trade Center and nowhere else. Video evidence also showed, by the way, we'll show you where else explosions were experienced. Video evidence also showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. There was no evidence of any blast or explosions in the region below the impact. That's absolutely not true, as you'll see from the witnesses. NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives. Well, we'll show you lots of evidence today. You ever see professional demolition where they set these charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, 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 says this paramedic. When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building, it started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash that came out of the building. Then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially, again, since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper. Probably should have been the only, certainly the first, if not the only, rational hypothesis that was considered. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions that appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. Lower level of the building, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think at this point, thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. He said, you mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. and another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now waiting to lay on all of us. It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these first responders do you imagine had their testimony included in the NIST report? 0, not 1. And yet they claim to have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. They missed all of these. NIST claims that it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Not to mention that there were no witnesses of explosions, which we just heard dozens and dozens of.
You can go almost anywhere
Well,
in the structure.
let's listen to Mark
and given
Loiseau.
the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
And here's a top-down controlled demolition. He says you can start anywhere you want. NIST says that, well, the top part drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. This is called the crush down, crush up theory. Well, there's a problem with this theory. It violates Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when 2 bodies meet, say a Mack truck and a Volkswagen. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. The lightest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below. It's a virtual pyramid. At the top, it's lightest, indicated by these columns at the top, very, very thin steel relative to what is coming below it. At half height, you get 16 inches by 22 inches with 2-inch thick steel. And then, as you see here, and heavier and heavier and heavier until at the bottom it's virtually solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches. Well, this theory was put out by Zdenek Bazan of Chicago Northwestern University. It's a 4-page paper, extremely complex, called the crush down, crush up theory. It was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. The rest of us are in shock, not knowing when the next attack is coming or who did it. But this industrious structural engineer and mathematics professor is busy creating the paper that became the justification for NIST's column failure theory, submitted just 2 days after 9/11. And structural engineers can't even understand it. It was finally decoded. What happened when it was decoded by Tony Zambodi and others? They found that the formulas are actually correct that they used, but the data, the input data, was falsified. There's 6 key errors. One, it's extremely obfuscated, so it was difficult to decode altogether. 2, they completely eliminate an entire story of columns, allowing the top part to fall 12 feet onto the bottom part and create a false dynamic impact. That's fraud. They doubled the mass up above from what was reality. That's fraud. They decreased the column strength below by a factor of 3. That's fraud. They decreased the velocity loss that would have been due to the law of conservation of momentum as one portion of the building hit an intact portion below. That's fraud. They eliminated the column reserve strength. These columns are 3 times stronger than they ever needed to be in order to withstand that pressure. And that's just been eliminated. So the results are that it's rigged 12-1 in favor of a collapse, at least more like 24-1. So this has been challenged in more than one way. They found, the challengers, that the downward movement would have been arrested after just 2 seconds of starting a path of destruction, which would have traveled, as we mentioned, upward, because there's an equal and opposite destructive force. So these have been published or submitted for publishing in the American Society of Civil Engineers journals, and yet the errors were upheld by default because they won't publish the paper that challenges them. Why? They say it's out of scope. Wait a minute. If it's out of, how is it out of scope to publish papers that show that a previously published paper was wrong, fraudulent, in fact? So this is an ethics case that remains outstanding. This has been challenged. So stand by for results on that. NIST says, well, there's a pile driver driving the rest of the building down, but can we look at that pile driver? Is it really doing that? Let's look at it this way. Watch the lower red line. It's not moving down. The top part is destroying itself or being destroyed before there's any downward movement. It's telescoping in on itself. It's a real problem for the official story. And look, we start and we see, just like the firefighters described, a band of explosions wrapping all the way around the building. Maybe that's what's destroying it. And let's look at NIST's theory here. They say that the perimeter columns are bowing in. Well, they are bowing in. But they say the cause is the sagging floor trusses, remember? Let's look at the perimeter columns. They're bowing in. In this looped video, you can see them bowing in. The question is, what's causing the bowing? Well, the floor trusses are connected to them, but what are the floor trusses also connected to inside the interior of this center of this building? Let's go back to FEMA first and listen to what they disclose here in their early investigation.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
This is exactly the opposite of what NIST told us later on when they took over the investigation. Here, Gene Corley has proven that the antenna falls first. Here's the antenna. It's falling. Yeah, it falls. It falls at least 20 feet before there's any downward motion from the parapet at the top of this building. Up, two, down, two, up, two, down, two, up, two, down, two. So what's the antenna sit on? It sits on a truss called the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on the core columns. So the core columns must be failing first, as Gene Corley concluded there. Then the hat truss and the antenna, which are sitting on these, descend before any perimeter columns descend or are pulled in. Then the core columns must be pulling on the floor trusses, as you can begin to see rather crudely in this animation done by others. The core columns go down, they pull on the hat truss, the floor trusses, and that pulls on the perimeter columns. So that's more likely the mode of failure. Plus, in all of the videos and photos, you don't see a top section, which would be where this red box is, driving the rest of the building down to the ground. Not one of them do you see that. If that were the case, you wouldn't have these remaining core columns standing 1,000 feet in the air 6 seconds after the collapse of the building, as you see here. And no, they don't turn to dust. They're shaken by another explosion, and the column descends frame by frame through the dust, which is shaken off of it, as you just saw. And it looks more like an explosion or series of hundreds or thousands of explosions, not unlike this volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with upward arching streamers, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, a geometry of fireworks. It doesn't look anything like a collapse when you look at it with the lens that we're offering you now. As did the reporters on the day of 9/11, who came up with a hypothesis of explosions from eyewitness reporting, narrative reporting, source-based reporting, and even the non-explosion reporters reported. We'll come back and look at that in a moment. But do we have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint? Well, let's look at it. Here's the South Tower. It actually begins to lean over, but the destruction is straight down and symmetrical, interestingly enough. Let's look at it. It leans over 22 degrees. So we'd expect it to fall off the building. So there's asymmetrical loading from this 30-story section of building. There's asymmetrical damage from the fires up above. There's asymmetrical damage from the impact of the airplanes. Then why do we have complete symmetrical damage all the way down the building, just like the firefighters described, all the way around the building? It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense. Let's zoom in. What do we see? Hundreds of explosions, individual explosions, not nuclear explosions, as some have ascribed to this event. We're seeing individual explosions floor by floor. Accurately placed close to each other. In addition to the squibs, which we'll get into in a moment, isolated explosions. Looking at this from another angle, on the lower right, you see that same series of explosions traveling almost, let's see if I can get that going, traveling almost as fast as the freely falling structural steel sections, indicating that it's almost, well, we'll talk about how fast it is in a moment, actually. Well, let's talk about the, continuing with the straight down theme. I mean, this building is only 200 feet wide, but the debris is equal all around the building, 12 to 1,400 foot radius. It is symmetrical about each of these buildings. In fact, destroying the Winter Gardens 600 feet away from the North Tower. And destroying buildings all around it. The steel frame is completely broken up, cut up, ready for loading and shipment. It's shattered all the way down. It fills the entire site of the complex and beyond. Compare that to Building 7, a nice, neat implosion, versus the very explosive event that we know as the World Trade Center Twin Towers. With ejections of building materials at the lower floors, what are we talking about here? Squibs, or isolated explosive ejections occurring here, here. NIST says, well, these are puffs of air being produced by that pile driver. Well, we saw that pile driver was destroyed in the first 4 seconds. There's no puffs of air. Plus, these are building materials. You can see the solids right here, and we'll talk about how fast they're coming out of the building also. But let's say that NIST was right, and that there was a section of building up above pushing the air, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, if that air is going to come into these open office areas, it's going to blow out all those windows or none of them, but not these highly focalized pinpoint ejections that we see all over the place. And here on the left side of the South Tower, in this looped video, again and again, we see dozens of ejections right before our very eyes occurring. Let's zoom into some of those with physics teacher David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the south tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
Interesting. Well, how fast are they coming out? He clocks them at 160 to 200 feet per second, 50 meters per second. These are explosive speeds, not air pressure speeds by a mechanical collapse. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go back to David Chandler, physics teacher, in a moment, where on the left, excuse me, let's go back. And on the left, a clock. On the right, an animation. It's extraordinarily fast. We have both of the towers in about 12 seconds completely destroyed from top to bottom. What does that mean? Let's go back to physics teacher David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First, note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall. The building is in near free fall acceleration. It's not decelerating. It's not decelerating when it meets the resistance of 80,000 tons of structural steel beneath the point of jet plane impacts. It should slow down, but it's getting faster and faster every second. How can it do that when it meets a facade like this, which is more steel in it than glass, which is because of the incredible strength required to resist wind forces from hurricanes. Its dead load capacity is 20 times what it needed to be, meaning it could hold up those loads, 20 times more loading, vertical loading. These columns that it's designed with are among those that retain their strength even after they are bent. So after the buckling period, there's a minimum resistance of about 25% of the original capacity of the column, meaning it would slow down the collapse. Even if all the columns buckled, you'd have 25% of their capacity to slow down this collapse, but it doesn't slow down. It gets faster and faster and faster. Let's look at it like this. On the right, we have held up over nothing but air the top 15 stories of the Twin Towers in this giant crane. On the left, we put underneath that same load 80,000 tons of structural steel, which is 5 times stronger than it needs to be to hold up the structure up above. Plus, we're going to give it the fraudulent 12 feet, 1 story of missing columns, so it can develop a dynamic impact on the structure below, which never could occur in reality, except for a few damaged columns. And I mean very few that NIST acknowledges, caused by the plane impacts. but we'll take them all out. Anyway, we drop these at the same time. What happens? This is 7th grade physics. We know intuitively that the structure on the right is going to fall at free fall, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, because there is no resistance. It will fall in about 10 seconds. The structure on the left is something else is going to happen, right? It's going to impact, it's going to hit resistance, it's going to slow down, probably stop and fall off. We know this without having to think about it too much. But we have to be invited to think about it. And that's what architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are doing for you. That's what Massimo Mazzucco does for you in his movie 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do apply, of course, and that's why we have a submittal from Richard Johns and Tony Sambodi and others, not to the American Society of Civil Engineers, who rejected their previous submittal, but in this case to Multi-Science Publishing, a Journal of Protective Structures. And this was received, well received, and has gained an extraordinary amount of attention. So do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame? Well, we go to the National Fire Protection 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, used in this country throughout and many other countries as well. And the effects of explosions is one chapter that says, look for shrapnel effects. Look for high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. Well, that's exactly what we see in the picture before us. Complete shattering down to these remaining shards near the bottom. This is shrapnel effects indicating high order damage. They're cut up to their 37.5-foot original lengths, in fact. And yes, their debris is thrown great distances as we go back to the 921 guide and see blast pressure wave effects. Look for those. Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, landing into structures up to 600 feet away. In fact, here, tracking these pieces, landing very far away, 300 to 600 feet, piece by piece by piece, including this one here, right out of there. Whoa, wait a minute. Back to, forward to, back to. It impacts building 7 here. Right about there. This is 45 degrees. It starts out horizontal, but gravity works down. How is this piece, 4-ton piece, sent horizontally? And why is it trailing thick white smoke clouds? Steel is not flammable in office fire or jet fuel conditions, as we'll see next week in part 3 of this series. Be sure to come back. But let's track these pieces and their mechanical velocity.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
78 miles per hour. That's enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And there's thousands of them, as you saw in the beginning of this webinar. By the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed outside the tower's footprint, what's crushing the building? Because it's not available to crush the building. It's a third of the weight of the building. What's crushing the building? The concrete, you say. The floors. We'll come back to that right now, in fact, because the floors are missing at the bottom of the towers. There was 110 of them, each of them an acre in size. Where are they? In a real pancake and collapse, like in Mexico, we see pancakes. All we see in the aftermath of the World Trade Center 1 destruction is a 2 to 3 story pile of twisted steel. Where's 110 floors? They are missing. Here they are, pulverized in midair before our very eyes. 90,000 tons of concrete missing from each building, pulverized to 100 micron particle size. Covering lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area, 3 inches thick, well outside the footprint of the building, comprising 30% of that dust, as documented by the U.S. Geological Survey. Let's look at the governor's testimony.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there was 90,000 tons of concrete. And by the way, if that was delivered and spread over 3 square miles, what's crushing the building? It wasn't the steel. It's not the concrete. That's 2/3 of the weight of the building, unavailable to crush it. Think about it. There were 10,000 file cabinets, but this is the only one that they could find. It survived because it was in the basement, this piece of it. Where's all the file cabinets? How about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. 700 bone fragments found on top of this building, the Deutsche Bank building. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because its ejections went past the Deutsche Bank building and out this direction. They didn't come from the people in this airplane because those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower, WTC-2. So they weren't from the people in the planes. Many of these fragments were from firefighters, as we can tell by the red triangles that are indicating firefighters versus the green ones indicating others. But the firefighters, of course, weren't on the scene at the time of the plane impacts either. So how did they get there? We have 2,753 victims, but only 300 whole bodies were found, most of those from the jumpers. 21,900 pieces of bodies were found, 6,000 of them small enough to fit into test tubes. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for, not even a piece to get DNA from. Vaporized. How does that happen? How do they get distributed, the pieces that they did find, over 800 feet from the towers? As they very carefully documented. Can gravitational collapse cause such pulverization and distribution of the body parts that they did find? Not to mention the 1,100 victims they did not even find a trace of. Well, so far, we've got 8 key characteristic features of controlled demolition. Fire doesn't create any one of these, let alone all of them. So, especially these fires, which are diminished and cooler at the time of the collapse. What about the testimony of the first responders? We already saw there's 118, but that increased to 156 through the continued research of Graham McQueen in 2015. I encourage you to look at this important work, Eyewitness Evidence of Explosions in the Twin Towers. But now there's .36 TV reporters talking about explosions as well. There were only 40 TV reporters the first day. And this is an article that documents the widely held belief that the Twin Towers collapsed as a result of airplane impacts and resulting fires is a revisionist theory. The vast majority of reporters on the ground who witnessed and who reported the event firsthand cited explosions as the cause of the collapse. Most people have no idea because the story changed abruptly the next day when the local TV anchors and national mainstream media outlets reported a very different story. Fire Marshal John Coyle and firefighter Christopher Fennew explicitly support this finding. I thought it was exploding, actually. That's what I thought. For hours afterward, everybody, I think, at that point still thought these things were blown up. And at that point, a debate began to rage about whether to continue rescue operations in the other still standing tower, because the perception was that the building looked like it had been taken out with charges. So they were going to abandon rescue efforts in the second tower, still the remaining tower. Graham McQueen and Ted Walters' new research is the systematic effort to collect and analyze the news clips from more than 70 hours of original coverage that day. It's an extraordinary work. They found 3 categories of on-the-ground reporting. 1, eyewitness reporting. 2, narrative reporting. 3, source-based reporting. Let's look at them. The condensed video clips in this short compilation revealed the impressive quantity, clarity, and magnitude of the explosive reporting on that day. Let's watch.
But as I was looking up, I saw the entire explosion. It looked exactly like the first 2, but we certainly had the most perfect vantage point for that explosion. It was unbelievable. And
there has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising, and I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower.
The 2 towers, a huge explosion now waiting to play on all of us.
We're not sure exactly what happened, but it was another explosion on the far side of one of the buildings from where we're standing. The reverberation and another explosion on the right-hand side.
Watch the right
it's
side.
Exploding.
It's ripping apart.
On the far side of the building, there seemed to be another explosion, and also on the right-hand side, there was also another explosion. We're not sure if that was extra reverberation from what happened at the World Trade Center, or if that was an added explosion.
We heard a very loud blast and explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
Again, there has been a second explosion here in Manhattan at the Trade Center.
And believe it or not, there was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down, sending smoke and debris everywhere.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion, a huge explosion, a huge rumbling cloud. We're taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
But it literally exploded and came down as though it had been hit.
We heard an explosion.
That explosion happened was shooting pieces of the plane. There are pieces of the plane on Church Street.
There's another explosion as we speak.
Something either exploded or fell off the side of the one building that was attacked.
Then the entire top of the building just blew up.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
It was just a small explosion, and then rocks and debris and everything started pouring down.
And we were about 2 blocks away when the second explosion hit, and all we heard was just this small explosion. Then you saw a roar of an explosion and all kinds of smoke billowing out, debris falling down.
It's unbelievable because you hear these explosions. In fact, I just heard another one. I don't know if it was like an after effect or whatnot, just while you were on the phone talking about the school closings. I'm hearing another explosion, just so you know. I'm hearing another rumble. What you can feel when these tremors come is that it literally comes up under your feet. That's what it feels like. That's the best way I know to describe it.
Certainly didn't imagine that there would be second or tertiary explosions, so they parked some of their vehicles in those areas, and many of those vehicles, people in those vehicles, have lost their lives.
Well, we just heard another explosion go off a couple of minutes ago, Chris, and saw a bunch more people sort of running this way. A woman on her bike was screaming as it went off, and there was a New York City officer. He was plain clothes walking by with a radio. I tried to stop him to ask what happened, and all he said was car bomb, and then I couldn't press him for any more information. He said when that last bomb went, or when that last collapse happened, and
When the first tower collapsed, it was a massive explosion. When that explosion occurred, it was like the scene out of a horror film.
Another explosion, a rolling blast of fire, a rolling column of fire towards us.
You saw people being wheeled on gurneys away from the site of the explosion. I looked up, and that's when I heard the, pardon me, That's when I heard the explosion. That's when the second tower came down.
It was an explosion.
2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower.
Saw the explosion and also the collapse of the tower.
With subsequent explosions and
explosions were coming down the building. It looked as if charges had been set on each floor and they were in succession going off.
He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. But the bottom line is that according to the chief of safety of the New York City Fire Department, he says that he probably lost a great many men in those secondary explosions.
would put us about a block and a half away from the site of where the explosion was. So their fear is that there may have been explosive device planted either in the building or in the adjacent area.
Office supplies, many blocks from the site of the actual explosion where they now...
I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street. And after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped.
And I was walking on Broadway at Fullerton, and suddenly we heard an explosion. It was the first tower coming down. I started to walk out. I walked down Broadway towards Canal, and we heard a second explosion.
Covered in the debris and the dust from the explosion itself. It was rocked with a lot of the explosion from the force of the twin World Trade Centers when they came down.
I was out front as you were when the second explosion occurred, because the explosion threw debris on top of a lot of people. That was when the real panic began.
Sequence of crashes, then explosions, and then the collapses.
This must have been ground zero where this thing blew up. Car after car after car. Buses completely obliterated and burned straight down to the steel.
That's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point.
The first wave of rescue workers who went in were trapped, many of them killed by the second blast.
And escaped through the lobby where they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
I believe the bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
NIST claimed there were no witnesses of explosions. And half of these reporters were witnesses, in addition to the first responder witnesses we looked at earlier. 21 eyewitness reports altogether. What they personally perceived as explosions before and or during the destruction. 22 narrative reports, wherein they refer to the destruction as an explosion-based event. And 3 were source-based reports, which is very interesting because they're from the fire department, the police department, and the FBI, the 3 most important government agencies involved, who said that they suspected that explosives were used to bring down the towers. The FBI even calling it their working theory. But something happened to all of these reporters after the first day, huh? Only 4 reports describe the collapse as a result of plane impacts and the ensuing fires. 4 reporters. One second. But their individual accounts add little to support what very soon became the official hypothesis. 2 of them were more than 12 blocks away. The third actually stated the entire building was just collapsed as if a demolition team set it off. When you see the demolitions in these old buildings. The 4th was quite close to the South Tower near Ron Insana, who vividly described seeing the building exploding and hearing a noise associated with an implosion. So they seem to be expressing either uninformed opinions or else carrying out someone else's instructions about the cause of the collapse. Unlike 118 first responders who provided their accounts weeks or months after the event, it was the job of these reporters to spontaneously communicate their perception and interpretation of the events. Thus, when their reporting is compiled into one record, we're left with a rich and largely unfiltered collective account of what really took place. Considered alongside the FDNY oral histories, these reporters' statements constitute strong corroborating evidence that explosives were used to destroy the Twin Towers. This hypothesis was not only prevalent among reporters, but was clearly the dominant hypothesis. The 21 instances of eyewitness reporting, all of which contain spontaneous descriptions of the phenomena the witnesses reported, the reporters witnessed, also strongly corroborate the overwhelming scientific evidence, which you're looking at in this presentation and next week's presentation, webinar series, that explosives were used to destroy the Twin Towers. The remaining research for McQueen and Walter team is now to examine how the hypothesis of fire-induced collapse so quickly supplanted the original dominant explosion collapse hypothesis. In other words, how the story got hijacked by the mainstream media the day after 9/11. And so now we turn to another set of witnesses, the observatory and the data therefrom from Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory 20 miles north of the World Trade Center, and data which FEMA and NIST reports relied on from the Columbia University report, because we have seismic signals near the time of the plane impacts. So the official narrative reports these as being due to the plane impacts. Okay, fair enough, until you start actually looking at the data, because we have a 0.7 magnitude at the South Tower and a 0.9 magnitude event at the North Tower. Excuse me. So let's look at it carefully. The event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But the plane doesn't impact until 14 seconds later. So how can the plane impact cause the seismic event? And these are all calculated for travel distance of seismic waves through the Earth media that they had there. The NIST says, well, we didn't look at, we don't believe the National Transportation Safety Board radar that the 9/11 Commission relied on, that's accurate to within 1 second. We looked at the videos and examined them, and we think that the event happened only 10 seconds later. But you're still 4 seconds off. Excuse me, 10 seconds earlier than the plane impacts. We think the plane impacts occurred 10 seconds earlier. Well, how do they resolve the 4-second discrepancy? They go back to Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in a private contract with a report that we can't get issued because Columbia University is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act as a private school or a non-government school. So they deploy their magic. Same thing, by the way, with the second plane impact. It occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds, but the plane doesn't impact, according to the NTSB radar, accurate to within 1 second, till 17 seconds later. So what does NIST do? Well, we've examined the videos, so we're going to trust our calculations instead, and we think the plane impacted 12 seconds before it actually did. But they're still 5 seconds off. What do? Again, they go back to LDEO in the same study and get them to move their data back 3 seconds in this case also. We don't get to know what's going on in that black box. This is called fraud, by the way. Well, what gives us a clue as to what really happened? I mean, if it wasn't the plane impact, what caused those seismic signals? Mike Picaro, he was in the basement. It says the whole building began to shake. There was a loud explosion. The two ascended the stairs to the sea level, about the middle basement level. They found the machine shop gone, nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking garage, found that too was gone. This is before the collapse of the building, obviously. Many seconds before. A steel and concrete door that weighed 300 pounds wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil. Lying on the ground, a bomb had gone off in the building. Well, here's one of the janitors in the building, Willie Rodriguez, who heard explosions down in the basement before the impact of the airplane up above.
Was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Well, this is very helpful corroboration. The bombs hitting the lobby or the basement and the basement first. Well, Andre Rousseau, applied geophysics expert, does a detailed analysis of all of this in 2012. He's the author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology. He says the frequency of these Rayleigh waves attributed by LDEO to the plane impacts were on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. But aircraft crash impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz and up to 100 hertz. So these frequencies were filtered out by the 0.6 to 5 hertz bandpass filters used by LDEO. So it doesn't even allow for the recording of such waves. This is extremely important. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events, like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz, not 10 to 100 hertz, which aircraft impacts do, create. So he says the seismic signals are not from the plane impacts. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened even before hitting the ground down the length of the building, in other words. Okay, let's look at the seismic signals recorded near the time of the building collapses themselves, because there's a 2.1 magnitude event when the first tower, the south tower, went down, WTC2. There's a 2.3 magnitude event when the north tower went down. Let's look at the north tower first. At 10:28 and 31 seconds, we have the waves, seismic waves, occurring. The tower starts descending 9 seconds before that, so okay. But the first debris doesn't even strike the pavement until 1 second after the first big wave. The heaviest debris strikes the pavement 4 seconds later. So that doesn't add up, because you'd expect the heaviest pavement to make the seismic signal. Well, NIST comes along and moves back the data, or gets LDEO to move them back, Columbia University, 3 seconds in yet another contracted 3-second shift that we can't get the cause for. But wait a minute. There's something else going on here. A very well-formed P wave and S wave, primary and shear wave. These are the Raleigh waves, the biggest ones. What formed these waves prior to the big waves? Well, interestingly, 4 seconds prior, there are explosions witnessed by cameras 6 and 10 seconds prior to the start of the descent of the tower, indicating what? That the first responders are corroborated here by these camera shakes. Let's look at them. Here's the first one. It shakes 6 seconds. Well, there it is. There's the shake. 6 seconds later, the start of the tower's descent. So we're not talking about the debris hitting the ground that's causing the seismic signal 6 seconds before the tower even starts to go down. Something else is going on. Just like the first responders said, like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, the tower is collapsing. Here again, on the top of this roof, we have a shake 10 seconds prior to the start of the descent of the North Tower. There's the shake. And here is the start of the descent of the tower. These are cameras on tripods, very sensitively picking up these shakes. So let's look at it. The start of the seismic event for the first collapse, the South Tower, occurs at 9:59 and 04 seconds. The start of the South Tower collapse doesn't occur except 5 seconds before that. And the first debris doesn't even hit the ground until 7 seconds after that. So how can the first debris cause the shaking 7 seconds earlier? It can't. So what does NIST do? They move back the seismic data yet again, a fourth time, from LDEO through Columbia University, moving it back 3 seconds. But what do we know about the South Tower? Yet again, we have shaking occurring at 9:58 and 56 seconds, 3 seconds before the start of the tower collapse of the South Tower. Let's look at it. This work, by the way, is done by Graham McQueen. Extraordinary work in 2009. Did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground? Here's the video. The shake is more subtle right there. That was the shake. And 6 seconds later, the beginning of the tower collapse, which causes more shaking. So the official narrative is that the signals occur near the time of the collapse due to the debris hitting the ground. There's a real problem here. It doesn't hit the ground. It hits concrete parking deck. And the contents, again, were pulverized to dust, the concrete. So there's no seismic component from the concrete in the towers at all. We talked about that already. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, 4 to 8 tons each, sending out 600 feet in every direction, peppering not the ground, but the 7-story concrete basement structure over a period of 15 seconds. There's no seismic component from them whatsoever. And they're equally distributed over the entire superblock beyond the parking structure itself as well. Both of these towers were identical. Excuse me, the collapses are identical. The towers are identical as well, for purposes of seismic. So how do we get almost an order of magnitude difference in the signal on the Richter scale, which is a logarithmic scale? We have 2.1 in the South Tower versus 2.3 in the North Tower. On the logarithmic scale, that's 1.6 more times energy in the North Tower for some reason, but not from a collapse. There must have been more explosives put into the North Tower. We can't imagine why. Maybe you can. So Andre Rousseau says identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. This is, by the way, summarized quite nicely by the Consensus 9/11 panel led by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin on consensus911.org. This is part TT7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. All of their work is extraordinary, highly recommended. By the way, some people say, well, gosh, the Seattle Kingdome produced a 2.3 magnitude event. The tower should have produced much more. Well, that's ridiculous. This is a 25,000 ton concrete roof, which impacts the ground virtually at once, versus the peppering of the ground and no concrete at all hitting the ground, producing seismic events in the Twin Towers. We're comparing to apples to oranges here. So I highly recommend that you look at these very important research efforts from these researchers regarding this evidence as we move on to the data from the FEMA and NIST reports, because NIST finally got $20 million and had some very specific objectives provided to them by Congress to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. Well, what was their own objective? Because they had a different objective. It was hidden on footnote 13, page 82 in their final report. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. It's called the probable collapse sequence. It doesn't include the actual behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. And collapse became, they say, inevitable. Wait a minute. You spent $20 million going right up to the initiation of collapse when you were tasked by Congress to explain the collapse itself. You stopped at the initiation of collapse. Spent 10,000 pages of readers' precious time, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes, 100 pages of fire modeling and safety issues, and only a half page on the events following the collapse initiation. In other words, the actual collapse itself. Well, let's see what you produced there. Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through the energy of deformation. It came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait a minute. This is not analysis. This is pure speculation. You could have analyzed the capability of the structure below to resist the falling structure above, as Tony Zamboti and Richard Johns and others had done. But you didn't. This is a pre-collapse report. It should have been titled the final report on the initiation of collapse of the World Trade Center towers. We wrote back with a request for correction, which you can do with agencies that commit fraud like this. And And they wrote back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. You were unable to provide any calculations whatsoever. You merely speculated. And you didn't even follow the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, which says look for evidence that explosives were used. NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. They put out in writing. But a year later, they finally admit NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. How can you find what you will not test for? You will never find what you don't test for or won't test for. It wasn't that hard to find. The experts found it. In fact, 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 911 Truth. One of them was William Rice, who says the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, while crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. New Mexico tech expert Van Romero. Explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. After airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Thomas Levy, or Mathis Levy.
If you've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Ronald Hamburger, structural engineer, not associated with AE 911 Truth. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Well, we showed you all kinds of evidence that bombs had been detonated today. Mike Taylor, National Association of Demolition Contractors. The collapse of the Twin Towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. Mirrored the strategy by demolition experts. Explosives are placed not just on the lower floors, but also on several consecutive floors, about a third of the way up the building. Cascaded down like an implosion. Andre Rousseau. Even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles north and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. How about the evidence? Surely it was protected and easily. The three largest structural failures in modern history.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't. And easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day carting this to barges sent to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. prompting so many architects and engineers through the use of the scientific method to determine that we have, so far in the case of the Twin Towers, 8 out of 10 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we have what we believe is proof of controlled demolition, but we want to hear from you. And so this is your opportunity to let Andy know what you think and ask questions if you're live with us today. Andy, how do they do that?
Yes, and we are live. We always get that question in the comments if we're live or tape, but we are live. So please submit any questions that you might have in the input form we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Select continuing education in the live webinars. You'll see a box right there, and we'll do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you are informed you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you. And while you're there, everybody, subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get the latest evidence that we're compiling, the latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation. Please join us. We want to let you know what's going on, and you need to stay informed and be able to provide our latest products to your friends, relatives, so that you're not just hanging out there alone. You need to get informed. You can do that on our website. We have an incredible evidence section, highly recommended. In fact, let's enhance that. And sign the petition while you're there. Join the 3,400 architects and engineers who are putting their reputations on the line. There's 20,000 others supporting them. You can be among them. And if you're an AE, please support us. You can also donate and support us that way. We have 6 employees who are working day and night trying to get this information out, and we need your support. It's gotta happen. You can make a one-time donation on our website, ae911truth.org. You can become a member, join the family of sustaining supporters that grace us with the opportunity and the capability of getting to all the engineers and architects out there, the media, through press releases and conferences, to engineers, architects, and academic institutions, and getting to our government officials as well. You can volunteer too. What do people do, Andy, to help us out?
Absolutely. First step is go to ae911truth.org, fill out the volunteer form there. You should be able to find it. It's a very easy form to fill out, and then within a few days we'll get in touch with you and get you to work. And there's different ways that you can help out. It all depends on really how you want to help out, whether you're the type of person that likes to talk to the public or if you're the type of person that likes to quietly do research. We can find stuff for you to do. There's always things to do around here, so please consider that. We're going to be talking to some new volunteers actually probably right after this webinar, but we always need more of them because, human beings can only get so much work done in a day, and most people have day jobs and stuff, so they're just given a few hours each night or a few hours each week, and we need more people to shoulder that load. So please consider helping out if it's running through your head right now.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And by the way, let's say you don't like working with people, but you want to help. You can send the AE911 Truth link out to every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know. Elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper, screen the DVDs. I'll show you an example of one of them in a minute. Share the brochures to people on the street. Just have a pack handy on your coffee table. They're, for $10 you can get about 100 of them. So please get the word out that way too. Download the WTC7 evaluation, the finite element analysis from Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, who just disproved the entire NIST report in a 4-year, $300,000 study, which you can download and you can even watch the movie about. It's available on Amazon now. Yeah, it's that good. Performed by the award-winning director of Loose Change, Dylan Avery. So it's about the Halsey report, and which is included in our request for correction, which we're now suing NIST to change and include the data that they have not, that they ignored, key structural components and the fraud that they had committed. They're going to have to come clean. And that lawsuit is going out. We're fundraising for it right now if you can help us with it. And it gets submitted in August. So be a part of that effort. And we want to tell your representatives about it. How does that work, Andy?
Absolutely. The first step, of course, is deciding that you're going to do it, and it's actually not that much work. All you got to do, first of all, is find out who your representative is. If you don't know already, go to their contact page. Everyone's got one. They all pretty much have one of three of the same websites, templates. And you find the option for meeting requests. And the one good thing about modern times and the issues we're dealing with now is that they'll take more meetings over the phone. So it gives you an opportunity to do this very action. And you make a request to talk to a representative or their staffer about the information presented here, more specifically, the request for correction that we'll be talking about on my show this week. And the lawsuit against NIST that's coming up here, or about the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. And I know that's the next slide coming up. And what that is that's draft legislation for a new investigation into the destruction of these towers, exactly what Richard has been calling for since he started AE 9/11 Truth, exactly why we do these webinars every week to educate more people. We got to have a new investigation, not just some show where members of NIST come and regurgitate the same talking points that we've heard for years. And of course, it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed by an explosion while he was entering the North Tower that day. We've worked with his father, Bob, for years, and it would set up a select committee to look into this evidence here, which we need. It's long overdue. So it's just sitting there waiting on the shelf for some brave congressman or congresswoman to step forward and take up this call. If you're out there and if you're considering running for Congress, you can do that too, and maybe you'll be the person that does it, or you'll be the person that your member of Congress listens to. So you want to learn more about it, go to ae911truth.org/justice, and it'll tell you more about the bill. But really, the main step is get involved and decide that you're going to do it. And if you need help or advice, you can write to us at Congress at ae911truth.org too. Simple to remember. So please consider it.
Thanks, Andy. And we'll do that presentation for you. Just get it set up for us. We'll go with you. So it couldn't be easier, like Andy said. We have some remaining hope for the grand jury investigation project and the FBI lawsuit. So cross your fingers and hang in there with those efforts, as well as the new inquest submitted, which is in a couple of weeks, will be submitted to the Attorney General in the UK for a new inquest into the death of Jeff Campbell, murdered on 9/11 in the 106th floor. Clear evidence of explosives in his death as well. And that evidence is nowhere more clearly depicted than in this landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, where we assemble 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence for you. We couldn't make it easier for you to share this evidence. Take just a look for a couple of minutes.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And you can watch this free on YouTube, the 1-hour version, or you can get the 90-minute version, which I highly recommend as a DVD. In fact, a double set. And that's on our website in our store at ae911truth.org. And also, our 50-page booklet can be downloaded for free at beyondmisinformation.org. It pulls the rug out from underneath the NIST theory altogether. And I highly recommend, though, the coffee table version, which I think is $10, which you can give to VIPs or have on your table and encourage people to read. Our classic lecture on this series is free on YouTube, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, as is the 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner. Highly recommended. Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7. But let's get to those questions. I think there are some, right, Andy?
There are many today. And just a quick comment, we get a lot of questions. Some of them are very off topic from the content of this lecture series. So we're going to stick to what we know here. It's not to invalidate anything that anyone is asking, but a lot of times if it's outside of our scope, then we probably don't know and we can't really give an authoritative answer to it. So just want to explain that. The first question, like I said, there's 6 of them today. Where specifically do you believe the explosives were placed? In the core, how many would be needed?
Great question, because clearly the core part of this building was more accessible In fact, we had the largest elevator modernization of its kind. Ace Elevator had this contract the 9 months prior to 9/11. They had 85 employees in the building, and they fled. They didn't stick around to help the firefighters use the elevator cabs as the rescue vehicles. So that's extremely suspicious. Quite a scandal documented by USA Today. But in the core, the elevator cabs are immediately adjacent to the core columns and beams. So that's a possibility. We also have a fireproofing upgrade, which is documented by Kevin Ryan. And that's on his site, Dig Within. And it could be that the fluid applied nanothermite, documented by Niels Harrod and his team of researchers, which we'll discuss next week on this webinar series, part 3, could have been applied because that fireproofing effort was, interestingly enough, in the 5 floors or so above and below the point of jet plane impacts in each of these buildings, which was 15 stories different from each other. So coincidentally, the plane hit the middle of the fireproofing effort in each of these buildings, even though they were different. So those planes knew where they were going, perhaps, and perhaps the fireproofing was a cover for the application of nanothermite. So we don't have the answers that you're looking for specifically here, but those are interesting research areas that still need to be exhausted. Andy?
Our next question asks, why aren't the squibs we see on both towers as they fell consistent with regard to location in both instances?
The squibs are isolated explosive ejections, and they do appear to be here and there, sometimes 20, 40, 60 stories below what we're told is a gravitational collapse, which can't be explained in the official narrative whatsoever. And so why are they in different places at different times? I don't know. Maybe they went off at the wrong time. You know, they went off early. Andy, you have any thoughts about that one?
That's basically what I was thinking. I mean, anytime you plan anything complex, there's always going to be something that goes wrong. And it's possible even that Building 7 itself was something that went wrong. Maybe it was supposed to go down earlier when nobody could actually watch it. Who knows? So it was probably mistimed. And that's why you would see them in different places, because obviously you don't want it to look like a controlled demolition as much as possible. So they would not want anyone seeing that far below the collapse line. So that's our answer. Next question is, what prompted whoever collected dust samples to collect those samples? Were they working independently?
Well, there are a bunch of people who collected dust samples. One was the U.S. Geological Survey, who was tasked presumably by Congress to collect samples and study them. R.J. Lee, an environmental engineer, also collected a bunch of samples. We'll be looking at these samples very specifically next week, Thursday, 1 p.m. In part 3 of this 3-part series, when we get into extreme heat and the incendiaries, forensic evidence of incendiaries found at the World Trade Center. We also have independently collected samples that just people got because, you know, there's 3 inches of dust on the ground and on the cars and on rails at bridges. So people would collect this, and then years later, they heard Stephen Jones or Niels Harrod were doing this important work, finding out what's in the dust. So they would send them samples. Do you have any other thoughts on this one, Andy?
Nothing too original here. I mean, why did people collect pieces of the Berlin Wall after it came down? Yeah, we all knew on the day it happened, this was an event that everyone was going to remember for hundreds of years later. We'd be studying it, so everyone wanted to get a piece of like remembering it, not in a gaudy tourist type of way, but just sort of as a, you know, something to look back at the event and be able to show it. to future generations with. And there was a lot of dust. We actually me and my friend went down there around Christmas. We went to New York City and we went to Washington, D.C. on the way back from Florida for Christmas vacation from college. And there was still dust a lot of places around ground zero. And we didn't get actually into ground zero, and they're not going to let us in. But there was a wall, but you could still see it. In fact, I got a picture. Maybe I should release these for the 20th anniversary of this album. There's nothing in regards to evidence in them, but just kind of interesting sights from around the city that day. But there was still dust on shop windows, and people were writing messages in it, remembering their loved ones and stuff. I got a picture of that. So it took a while for some of that dust to be cleared away. Next question is, do you think whomever did it thought there might also be a possibility that would also damage the river wall and cause flooding?
The basements of the World Trade Center, the parking structures, occupied a greater area than the Twin Towers themselves. And the vertical wall surrounding that is called a bathtub. And there's actually a river on the outside of that wall. It's called a slurry wall. It's waterproofed with bentonite. And if it collapsed, it would be catastrophic. Maybe it just occurred to me now that that's one of the reasons that the Twin Towers weren't a classic implosion like Building 7. Maybe they wanted to avoid damaging that wall with such a big thud when the towers came down. So instead, they made them very explosive. So they would be a 12 to 1,400 foot radius of damage, which includes outside. Most of that is outside the bathtub wall. So that just occurred to me for the first time. So thank you for asking this question, because the Twin Towers look like an explosion, not an implosion like Building 7. It would have been much more believable as a collapse if they came down internally in an implosion. A whole lot more believable. It's just so obvious right now. Again, all of the steel, almost all of the steel and almost all of the concrete is outside the footprint and well beyond that, of course. So it's not going to have as damaging an effect on the bathtub wall as it would otherwise. So a great question, and we can only speculate at their thinking, but maybe that was part of it.
Okay, our next question asks, was Bobby McIlvaine's body taken away from the scene before the buildings collapsed?
I think that's true. Do you, Andy?
Yeah, Bob McIlvaine has said it on my show. I can't remember what episode, but that Bobby was already at the morgue before the first of the two towers came down that day. So, yes.
Before the towers came down, he was at the morgue. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's clear then. So he had an hour notice before either of the towers came down, but after the planes hit.
Exactly. Yeah, he was killed by an explosion as he was entering in, and for another project I've been working on. Yeah, I did interact with Bob and verify this and the damage to the body. So yeah, I can confidently say that.
So the towers were hit. Oh, and maybe that was even one of the explosions that occurred before the plane hit the building.
Yeah, it was as he was entering the lobby.
Yeah, because why would he enter the lobby if the plane had already hit the building? That was the North Tower, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you would stay outside and watch. You wouldn't be going into a burning building or adjacent to a burning building.
Unless you're a first responder, there'd be no good reason to.
What?
Unless you're a first responder, there'd be no good reason to go into the building.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there are people trying to.
The gawking factor, you'd want to stay outside and see, oh my God, a plane hit that building. I'm going to stay out here and watch it. I'm not going to go inside and take a risk.
Exactly. Last question says, can you discuss your view of scientific epistemology and how the mainstream view is different and corrupt?
I'm an architect. I don't know about scientific epistemology, but I do know the mainstream media is different and corrupt. They've censored the truth about what really happened here. From us, our evidence for 15 years now, and others for more than that. Do you have an idea what he's getting at here, Andy?
Well, according to Cass Sunstein, we have a crippled epistemology, and that's why they have to send people to infiltrate our groups and slowly introduce elements of the official story to us. But basically, I had to look the word up. I've heard it before, but just to have a full understanding, epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. And of course, I think the mainstream view has a crippled epistemology because they refuse to even consider the option. I've always used the example of a scene where you find a dead body and the head is separated from the shoulders, laying next to it, a nice neat pattern. And the police rule that it was an accident. The head just rolled right off the body. It's a new phenomenon. We've never seen it before. I know it's weird, but that's what happened. Trust us. Your common sense says that doesn't make any sense. We have a new phenomenon here. Heads rolling off of bodies and onto the floor. And they just continue to sit by it because maybe the victim is the wife of an important person or something like that. Now, that's kind of a ridiculous scenario, but it's not much different than what we were facing here with the World Trade Center evidence. And so, when we talk to people, and I've talked to architects and engineers, and we hold them in very high regard when they sign our petition and all that, but I find a lot of them are not much different when they're opposing us than the general public. They just say it can't possibly happen. It's already been explained, but they don't know what the explanation is. You ask them to go into why they support the official story. What does NIST say happened inside Building 7? They'll say, I don't need to explain that to you. The government ran reports on it, and I stand by them. I had one guy try to say that there must have been a simultaneous earthquake on the day of 9/11, and that would explain Building 7. I said, that'd be some pretty bad luck if you had an earthquake on 9/11. Of course, it didn't make any sense, but the guy was just trying to get through the moment because he didn't want to face it. So I think, regardless of what Cass Sunstein says and how they justify their terrible behaviors, I think that the people who are pushing the mainstream narrative have the crippled epistemology, and that's my opinion on it.
Well, that sounds like a great answer to me. I really appreciate the help there, Andy. I'm with you on that one.
Okay, that's it. So for my part, thank you everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, and this is part 2, Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. Guess what? Just like I said, we'll be here in 1 week, Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific, for part 3, the Twin Towers in Extreme Heat. We'll be going into much more detail with the high-rise fires, the pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. You're going to hear about all of it. And then we started all over again a week after that with part 1 in August. So that's incredible that you joined us, everybody. Really appreciate it. Full house today. And let us know what you think. Give us a thumbs up and follow our station, AE 911 Truth YouTube station channel. And we'll catch up with you next week. Bye for now.